And then suddenly, zoop, you're back in your mind and the person's saying, so what do you think? And you're going, I agree.
Yeah. Yes.
I think it really, really gives you an insight into why mindfulness may be such a good strategy when it comes to ADHD.
This is the most interesting thing to me, I think, the whole paper.
Welcome to this episode of the Research Recap. Today we have 3 really interesting papers to discuss, looking at mind wandering, its relationship with ADHD, as well as emotional dysregulation, and something that I recently learned how to say perfectly, I hope, cyclothymia, which is looking at a connection between ADHD and some mental health conditions as well. Okay, so the first thing we're going to get into today is a paper called Excessive Mind Wandering, Rumination and Mindfulness Mediate the Relationship Between ADHD Symptoms and Anxiety and Depression in Adults with ADHD. This is from Clinical Psychology and Psychotherapy. And basically what they wanted to know is, what is the relationship between these different ways that we can mind wander, so mind wandering, rumination, or ways we can become present using things like mindfulness in adults with ADHD, and also what is the relationship between those things and anxiety and depression. So Sarah, do you want to take us through a little bit of the methodology?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So first thing, the sample size is 175 adults who were admitted to a psychiatric clinic in Turkey and who also had ADHD. The diagnosis was confirmed by a clinician using structured clinical interview through DSM, and then a number of self-report scales. And actually, this is the most interesting thing to me, I think, the whole paper, even more so than the findings. So, we've got the one that shows up pretty much every time, the ADHD self-report scale. They also looked at an anxiety and depression scale specifically. And then they had scales for mind wandering, rumination, and mindfulness. And I thought it was really important to sort of talk about how they conceptualize each of these variables, because it really helps to paint a picture of what that experience is like to go through. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, definitely.
Close your eyes and visualize it. No, it's okay. So mind wandering is defined in this paper as rapid, multiple, jumping thoughts, distracting, independent of negative emotions, and causes mental restlessness and ceaseless mental overactivity.
So mind wandering would be if you've ever been having a conversation with somebody and then you found yourself kind of thinking about something else during the conversation.
Yeah. Oh gosh, did I turn off my coffee machine at home?
What is that other person saying?
Yeah.
That other conversation.
Oh man, I never placed that order on Amazon. Gosh. Yeah.
And then suddenly zoop, you're back in your mind and the person's saying, so what do you think? And you're going, I agree.
Yeah. Yes. And I think that this one is related because with an excessive amount of mind wandering, it can lead to this concept of rumination, which they define as repetitive and excessive focus on negative thoughts, often related to past events or perceived failures.
So this is what you do before you go to bed at night if you don't listen to a podcast most of the time, which is, that experience that you have where you think, not did I leave my, thing on, but remember that time that I left the oven on? Remember that time that I had my mind wander when I was supposed to be talking to someone and then I didn't know what to say next? Like that's rumination.
Sort of, did I lock the door, after just locking it and then having to check it and then getting into the car and be like, did I actually check it or did I just think that I checked it? And then getting back out.
Why am I like this? Yeah. That's all part of rumination.
Yeah, exactly. Because people definitely will call you out on it, but that has nothing to do with how they defined it. But yeah, there's stigma.
Yeah, definitely. And so these are things I'm sure when you're listening to this, you're thinking, yep, I have done these for sure.
Yeah. So what do you do about it? So the last one actually that they focus on is mindfulness, which they define as a mental state characterized by non-judgmental awareness of one's thoughts, feelings, and experiences in
Such
the
a good definition of
present
mindfulness.
moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I told a client something today and he looked at me and he was just like, respectfully, no, thank you. And we sort of laughed about it because we both knew it was like the right thing, right? But with ADHD, sometimes it can be like non-judgmental awareness of my own thoughts. Like, that's not for me. But you can do it. I promise you can learn how to do this. So they go on to talk about, they state a different paper, but basically they say that individuals with ADHD have a reduced ability to be mindful due to the nature of their core and comorbid symptoms.
Executive dysfunction.
You know, like the mind wandering and the rumination. And also the executive dysfunction, which perpetuates the whole thing.
Yeah.
All of the negative
100%.
cognitions are sort of reinforced over a period of time.
Yeah, exactly. So what they wanted to find really was, how do all of these things relate? And when you actually look at the paper, which I did, the first thing they found was that there was no relationship between ADHD and anxiety and depression, which I thought was really interesting. And it was only when they did a correlational kind of mediation model, which we can talk about in a second, that they found a relationship between ADHD symptoms, according to their study, and anxiety and depression symptoms using excessive mind wandering, rumination, and mindfulness as mediators. So, Sarah, do you want to explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so I think it would be best actually to start at the end and talk about what happens when you're experiencing an emotional dysregulation event, such as mind wandering, rumination. I mean, there are so many, like it could be like a panic trigger, like anyway. And also, you have sort of low awareness of what is happening to you in the present moment. So that would be called low mindfulness. That would be a low mindfulness factor. And that would basically mean that you don't have support strategies for when those things happen to you, which means that they continue to happen to you. And it's just this vicious cycle of like no support and not getting better. Which I think is really hard to say out loud, but that's what this paper is talking about. And I think, I mean, it really wants to come from a place of like supporting people in a better way. So I mean, encouraging the building of mindfulness skills. When you define mindfulness as just non-judgmental awareness of your own thoughts in the present moment, that really just means that like you can recognize that you are dysregulated and you can be like, okay, cool. I see me. I see me like this right now. And, you know, it could be better. Like maybe we can do something about this. But right now, I think I'm just going to let myself be dysregulated and like see what I can learn from this. You know, it's like introspection and acceptance and, you know.
It's really interesting. I've been trying to engage in mindfulness just for like not very long, but just in the morning. I usually have podcasts in, and so I'll turn off the podcast and try and be mindful. And so often the last couple of weeks, it's just been an immediate reality of like, wow, I'm very tired, or like my shoulders are very sore, or something else is going on. It's funny how quickly your brain can do this. For those of you who don't know, I have a 4-month-old, so the tired part is pretty normal, but it helps to understand where you're at before you then start. For me, starting a day full of clients and meetings and presentations and podcasts. So basically what they found was that ADHD symptoms were linked to more likelihood to engage in excessive mind wandering and rumination. And that was then linked to anxiety and depression. So they didn't find a direct correlation, but they did find a mediating correlation. And what they also find was that anxiety symptoms are related to less mindfulness, and mindfulness itself was related to less anxiety and depression symptoms, indicating, and this is just a correlation, so it is an indication, that if you engage in mindfulness, you might not be as likely to have those anxiety and depression symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So what mindfulness does is it really tries to help you bring your attention to the present moment, which is
Mm-hmm.
meant to limit mind wandering and inattention in general.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's exactly what this data is suggesting and sort of what other research suggests. They cite a number of studies into the
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness research and things. So
Yeah. And in terms of practical implications, that is so interesting and very exciting, because I think it really, really gives you an insight into why mindfulness may be such a good strategy when it comes to ADHD, because this sort of different from the rumination and excessive mind wandering that we can engage in, or it's sort of more of an understanding of like, I'm resisting that. That's interesting. Or, I don't want to do that, or I'm experiencing shame right now.
one paper calls it hypoactivity. You're able to like exhibit the impulse control and sort of be aware that you're, doing the impulse control.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
feels really meta when you think about it, like a total, like you can step out and like see yourself moment. It's not really
Mm-mm-mm.
like that, but at least if you can visualize things in your brain, who knows?
Mm-mm-mm. You can decide that way.
Not
It
me.
helps a little bit. If you can visualize things in your brain, then you can decide how you want to respond to them instead of them
Sure.
deciding how you want to respond. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's part of what it is. I did also want to just make a note, because when I looked at this paper, something that came up was, they just said it. Individuals with ADHD have a reduced ability to be mindful due to their nature of their core symptoms. And I think we just mentioned that. But the other thing they didn't talk about is sluggish cognitive tempo. And for those of you who've listened to this podcast for a very long time, shout out to you. You will know that we talked about the idea of sluggish cognitive tempo being related to ADHD. And it was interesting to see here, they've said that they didn't end up using it as a mediating factor because they found that it's a distinct construct from ADHD in one of those later studies that have come out. So it was interesting to sort of see here again that concept being considered and then rejected. So for those of you who are still interested in that, I just wanted to flag that as well.
That is very cool.
Yeah. I just got a remarkable download ability, so I've been using that to read all these papers. So I'm learning a lot more from these papers. This is a PSA to anybody who's ever thought, maybe I should like look at whatever I'm engaging with in a different format. It's so helpful often.
Does it help with the screen glare?
Yeah, I struggle to engage with things on the computer screen personally. And so downloading it into like a paper-like format, and this helps me not have to print everything out. So yeah, very, very helpful. Okay. So what are some of the limitations of this study? Because it did have a few limitations.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as with a lot of studies, it had that whole self-report bias aspect. They didn't really talk about comorbidities in this paper, which, definitely other conditions could be associated with mind wandering, especially rumination and low mindfulness.
Yeah, especially rumination.
But for sure, the biggest one is that there was no control group because by design, they wanted specifically a clinical sample. So that limits sort of, and I think exaggerates some of the severity, right?
Yeah, it is hard in that context to say for sure that, we would have liked to have seen a non-ADHD sample or control sample and found that they didn't have the same responses with rumination and mindfulness, etc. That would have been more interesting. So yeah, having a control sample is always good, but not always possible, which is why these studies don't always have them.
We know that ADHD can feel overwhelming and frustrating, and that's on a good day. And we don't want anyone to have to navigate that alone.
That's why we created the ADHD Academy, where adults with ADHD can meet, join, share stories, and support each other in a judgment-free way. If you want to connect with others who truly understand you and learn research-based strategies to help you feel more in control and build momentum in your life and work, you found the right place.
Together, let's transform your ADHD challenges into strengths. If you'd like to know more, you can click the link below to join us in the ADHD Academy.
Hope to see you there. So, Jumping into the next study, they looked at the relationship between ADHD-like traits, which we'll talk about in a second because that was important, and emotional dysregulation in the adult general population. So this was a paper from Advances in Neurodevelopmental Disorders, and they had a very interesting focus. They wanted to know if there was a relationship between ADHD symptoms and emotional dysregulation among people not diagnosed with ADHD. And I have to be honest, it took a while for me to get my head around this. So Sarah, do you want to take us through a little bit about what this is and why they were looking at people not diagnosed?
Yes. So actually, both of the next two studies that we're going to be talking about were focusing specifically on people who were not diagnosed with ADHD. I'll talk about this one first. Essentially, they said right in the paper that they weren't going to study emotional dysregulation and ADHD symptoms amongst the diagnosed population because that one's been done, like case closed. There's a relationship, but they wanted to also look at it in terms of like subclinical populations, people who don't quite meet the threshold for ADHD, but like, are they still suffering from symptoms? Really, just to look at that. And see if it really exists sort of more on a spectrum or continuum or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, that's why.
They really need to tell that to the DSM. It's kind of funny. They're like, case closed. We don't need to look at emotional dysregulation in people with ADHD. I'm like, could you tell a lot of people?
Yeah, first of all. Yeah.
So they had a huge sample, like 1,074 neurotypical participants.
Yeah, which is specifically excluded people that were diagnosed with ADHD or people who hit over the threshold of the ASRS, which is the ADHD self-report scale. So yeah, like exactly. Really just looking at the people who have lower to no symptoms and sort of what does that look like in terms of their emotional dysregulation.
Which is interesting because I think
shout out to the medium people.
Yeah. So true. It really does create this interesting conversation, which is, when is your ADHD your ADHD? Because I know there'll be a lot of people who are listening who haven't been diagnosed yet, or maybe they weren't diagnosed. Like they were like, oh, well, you're subclinical, so it doesn't count, or it's not really affecting your life negatively enough, so it doesn't count. Yeah. And so this is an interesting conversation into like, well, maybe you're still experiencing specific struggles, even if you don't have a diagnosis, which I'm kind of amazed is really a thing that people are studying. But I mean, go for it. So what did they find? I'm so
happy that they are. Well, first, I also want to say that they measured, because this was interesting to me, they measured emotional dysregulation with a scale, kind of exactly by that name, the difficulties in emotion regulation scale. And it talks about different dimensions of that, which is like questions on impulse control, lack of emotional clarity, and lack of emotional awareness, just to name a few, like broad. And I thought that was really interesting because it just shows that there's more to emotional dysregulation than just the physical stimuli. Do you know what I mean? Like there's that, but then also there's like not really being sure what's going on or what's causing what's going on. Not really sure if you have any like strategies that creates other problems, you know, and they all sort of compound. And so I loved researching this scale, and it was really good.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it is very, very interesting. And I definitely, when you said not knowing what's going on, I'm like, who among us has not had that experience? Okay. Yeah. So results. Let's get to results.
To the best of us. So I think that the long and short of this is that as inattention and hyperactivity symptoms increased in severity, there was also an observable associated increase in the severity of most aspects of emotional dysregulation as they measured it. So basically like positive correlations here. What we should talk about is significant, independent, positive predictors. What the heck? What is that?
Yeah,
no, I know what it is now. I looked it up. Oh, man. So pretty much, I looked it up, okay? So the positive relationship means that as one goes up, the other one goes up, okay? And then the predictive relationship part means that they're dependent on each other. So they can be used to predict changes in the other. which is really good.
Yeah.
And so in this study, pretty much everything had significant independent positive predictors with each other.
Yeah, which means if inattention went up, emotional dysregulation went up. So the more ADHD
symptoms,
you were,
more emotion.
Yep.
Well, it's chaos.
Exactly. And it was the case even for people who were, like, as we said, subclinical. So it's interesting because people say, oh, well, everybody is a little bit like that. And so this argues kind of like, to the extent that everybody is a little bit ADHD, those everybody's are also a little bit emotionally dysregulated.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that is such a terrifying statement, but a really great way to put it, I think.
Mm-hmm. So tell us what the limitations are before we kind of go too far down this rabbit hole.
I mean, same as the other self-report convenience sample. It was just pretty much like whoever they could get. So, that could be self-selecting in some ways. Maybe not indicating ADHD, but whatever. But
yeah,
I think the important thing to talk about here is that the fact that there is still a link, such a drastic link between emotional dysregulation symptoms and ADHD symptoms, suggests that this link exists for everybody, subclinical people, everybody, just as Skye said, as one is affected, so is the other. As above, so below, as they say.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's sort of representing that whole relationship. And that's why the conversation that we had at the beginning about mindfulness and sort of increasing those skills so that you can increase your awareness of the dimensions of your dysregulation, we can start to get a handle on these things.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think, if you think about it in terms of the next study that we're going to talk about, which also looks at people who are not diagnosed with ADHD, it is interesting. These papers all very much work together. So the next paper that we're going to discuss is clinical characterization of coexisting ADHD symptoms in a sample of adults with cyclothymia. This was a preliminary observational study, so very much saying, hey, this is just the beginning. And it was from the Journal of Affective Disorder Reports. And it's from 2024, so very, very new. And what they wanted to know is, quite simply, what is the rate at which cyclothymic disorder is comorbid with ADHD? So how did they do that, Sarah?
Well, they recruited 147 adults who met the diagnostic criteria for cyclothymia. For anybody who doesn't know, sort of cyclothymia is a mood disorder that's characterized by depressive and manic episodes, people with bipolar, maybe major depressive that's characterized with mania. They sort of measured ADHD symptom presentation with the ASRS. They looked at emotional dysregulation with a totally different sort of scale, but it was looking at like reactivity, intensity, stability of emotions and things like that. Yeah, just sort of gave them these scales and see what they got.
Awesome. So what did they find, Sarah?
So I think the bombshell finding here is that 43% of their sample met criteria for a full ADHD diagnosis, which is a ridiculously high comorbidity rate, I think. I mean, it's among the highest. The only other high morbidity rates that we see are things like for non-specified sleep disorder or autism or things like that are extremely comorbid. But cyclothymia is definitely not one that we hear of. I actually already knew about it because I sort of have some background knowledge of bipolar and mood disorders in general. Shout out to my emotional queens. But essentially, like, Gen Pop doesn't know cyclothymia, So for 43% of those people to come away with an ADHD diagnosis after this study, that is huge. I mean, maybe they were expecting that. Maybe that's exactly what they were expecting. They also found that 75% of the sample had at least one other type of diagnosis, psychiatric or otherwise.
Which really sort of continues that conversation about the idea of this is just a big cloud, I think it's called, of things. And often people have more than one, and the importance of looking for more than one.
Yes, just sort of knowing that there's even still more to look for. Like, it's not always intuitive. Things can get bad or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
But sort of personally, I think these researchers were looking to find and identify specific red flags in these mood disorder patients because they talk about the documented comorbidity, but then go on to say that it's not studied very much. And so they wanted to do this essentially so that those red flags would trigger clinicians to screen for ADHD more commonly. This sort of ties back to another conversation we had recently about screening as part of like routine checkups as a kid. You check your eyes, so you check if you have ADHD symptoms or sort of quality of life or, something like that. It could change things forever. But specifically the things that they found that were more common amongst the ADHD participants were things like affective instability, which is like mood instability, negative emotionality, emotional impulsivity. Well, yeah. But what's interesting is that all of those things also are hallmark mood disorder symptoms.
Yeah.
And the reason specifically, like Sky was like, why are we talking about this? And the reason why I think we should talk about this is because, women sort of generally have higher emotionality scores compared to men. And so more often, due to the subjective nature of diagnostics, women will get flagged for mood disorders instead of ADHD. And as the previous paper showed, the ADHD is actually the underlying factor. And when you support that, then the anxiety and depression goes away. But they try to treat it the other way. They say like, oh, we'll treat your anxiety and depression and then we'll treat your ADHD. But like that research paper was like, no, don't do that.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think it's the idea of which one goes first, because I think this is becoming increasingly important as we learn more. I mean, I think it was always important, but it's also comes down to like if you do decide to medicate, it's like which one do you do, because that's also going to have a factor.
Treatment options? Yeah, exactly. Because with mood disorders, they're going to be much less likely to want to prescribe you stimulants if you've ever had any kind of like manic episodes.
Yeah.
But they say the same thing about antidepressants, to be honest. So it's really interesting.
It is interesting as well, because as ADHD coaches and researchers, we tend to see people who say, I was diagnosed with a mood disorder and that wasn't the key, and it was more the ADHD that was the key. If there are people out there who say, I was diagnosed with ADHD and that wasn't the key, it was my depression, we don't tend to see those people. So I do just want to call out that kind of limitation that we have in our own experiences.
Yeah,
however, it's also something that the research indicates it might be the other way around. It might be the ADHD. So it's definitely an area that needs more research.
Yeah, which is why it's really important to talk about these pieces of research. It hopefully might inspire other people to go do some more.
Yes.
It's just really interesting to me how in this very ADHD space, emotional impulsivity, unstable moods, negative moods, those all feel very much like hallmark ADHD symptoms, like hashtag same. But like also in the mood disorder space, those are hallmark symptoms. Yeah. So it's just really interesting. And so, I don't know, it all seems to be sort of part of that neurodivergent experience. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things I love about what we do, I was just thinking that this morning as I was reading papers before I came on here, is that the more papers we research and go through, and the more you guys listen to us do that, the more it starts to paint a picture of what is going on in the ADHD research space. I feel like I have a much better understanding of it than I did this time last year when we were just starting out. And a lot of it is that connection between the emotional aspects of ADHD are becoming a lot more studied.
Yeah, it's just really exciting to be doing this work and sort of being able to integrate it all at like all the levels. I'm able to sort of bring experience from coaching or from the academy into the podcast and vice versa. And that's so wonderful. And yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I've been on this research binge for probably years, which is why I know all this stuff about like random personal stuff,
Yeah.
But in terms of just the ADHD specific research and like all of the comorbidities, and sort of the different scales that are available, I mean, it's all just awesome. I don't even think we've seen it all yet. Like,
definitely not. Definitely not. There's a lot more. There's a lot more.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that wraps up today's episode. Really interesting. Lots of very interesting takeaways. For those of you who don't know, by the way, Sarah writes the descriptions of this podcast and she puts the takeaways in there as well. So if you're looking for a reminder, check out that description because they will be there. Awesome.
There's important information.
Yep. Okay. Till next time. See you later.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD Lab next week.